Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another edition of the Cusp. I'm Doy Santos, your host. On this edition, we're going to be asking the question, why have democratic forces fallen out of favor in the Philippines, and how they can win it back? It's important at the top of the show to define our terms here. I'd like to do this by way of question and answer, so here it goes. Question 1. What do we mean by democratic forces? By that I mean the leaders and constituents who were responsible for fighting authoritarianism in the 1970s and for restoring democratic institutions in the 1980s and sought to maintain them ever since. What do we mean by fallen out of favor? It means losing at the ballot box, as in 2016 with the election of President Duterte, who ruled Davao's mayor with an iron grip, and in 2019 when the entire opposition slate of Ocho Derecho failed to make it to the Senate, which consolidates Duterte's power and control over the legislative branch. Finally, what do we mean by democracy? By that we mean not only the system of obtaining popular mandates through universal suffrage, but the democratic system of checks and balances, the freedom of the press, respect for rights of the minority, observing due process, and the rule of law. So, having defined all these terms, we come to the question, why have democratic forces fallen out of favor? And the answer to that is quite varied and multidimensional. I'm going to start to peel away at these layers of the answer by starting first with the global forces that have brought us to this situation before focusing on the local forces. By that I mean that the Philippines is not unique or alone in facing this crisis, but is part of a global trend with Vladimir Putin in Russia, Narendra Modi in India, Erdogan in Turkey, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and Trump in America. So let me begin with some of the global forces first that help explain this situation around the world before going to the particular case of our country. In answer to the question that we've posed, here are some possible explanations for the waning of democracy around the world. Number one, the rise of the far-right nationalist leaders around the world can be traced to the effects of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, now that's a term that's known widely but is not often used in the Philippine context. What do we mean by that term? It refers to the late 20th century resurgence of ideas of laissez-faire economic liberalism and free market capitalism that were popular back in the 19th century. Free markets means the opening up of borders to trading of goods and services, what we often term as globalization. Danny Roderick, a professor of political economy, has explained it this way. He says, sometimes simple and bold ideas help us see more clearly a complex reality that requires nuanced approaches. I have an impossibility theorem, quote unquote, for the global economy that is like that. It says that democracy, national sovereignty, and global economic integration are mutually incompatible. We can combine any two of the three, but never have all three simultaneously and in full. So, by that, he means that globalization, or the integration of world markets under a system of free trade, will either weaken national sovereignty, as in the case of the EU or European Union members, where nations voluntarily surrender their ability to set monetary and immigration policy, or it will weaken democracy, as in the case of Russia, with the emergence of Putin, or China with the consolidation of power by President Xi Jinping. What Professor Roderick is saying is that you can't have all three: globalization, national sovereignty, and democracy. What happened in the US with the election of Donald Trump is that swing states in the Rust Belt of America, in the Midwest, wanted him to restore national sovereignty, which they felt they had surrendered to global institutions like the World Trade Organization or the United Nations. These were workers in the manufacturing and coal mining sectors of the country that had been ravaged by imports from abroad, aka from China and from Mexico, and had been sort of weakened by regulation due to America's commitments to things like the Paris Accord on climate change. In other words, globalization created losers out of them, eroding their standard of living, causing them to vote at the ballot for someone who promised to restore their dignity. This is a situation that is familiar to many in developing nations, such as in Latin America, for example, or like the Philippines, which have adopted neoliberal policies ever since the 1980s debt crisis, and where populist leaders from both the left and the right have risen in response. This leads me to the second reason why democracy has fallen out of favor. Number two is the rise of populism. There's been a populist backlash against the tide of neoliberal capitalism that has swept the world since the 1980s. What do we mean by populism? Well, Francis Fukuyama, another notable political economist from Stanford, offers three definitions. The first is populism is a regime that pursues policies that are popular in the short run but unsustainable in the long run, usually in the realm of social policies. Examples would be price subsidies, generous pension benefits, or free medical clinics. A second has to do with the definition of quote unquote the people that are the basis for legitimacy. Many populist regimes do not include the whole population, but rather a certain ethnic or racial group that are said to be the true quote unquote people. A third definition of populism has to do with the style of leadership. Populist leaders tend to develop a cult of personality around themselves, claiming the mantle of charismatic authority that exists independently of institutions like political parties. They try to develop a direct and unmediated relationship with the people they claim to represent, channeling the latter's hopes and fears into immediate action. It is typically coupled with a denunciation of the entire existing elite, which is of course invested in existing institutions. End of quote. So, Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, for instance, was an example of the first and the third type of populism that Fukuyama mentioned. He used the state's revenues from the export of oil, which Venezuela is very well endowed with, to bankroll social programs, which became unsustainable in the long run when the price of petrol fell. Nigel Farage in the UK and the far-right movements across Europe are examples of the second type of populism, where their focus has been primarily against immigration and treating certain ethnic groups within their society as not really representing the true English people. Even though these are people who were born and grew up in the UK. In the developing world, Modi's ethnic nationalism is another form of this kind of racial and ethnic populism. Finally, in our case, both Joseph Estrada and Rodrigo Duterte are examples of the third form of populism. Because while Arab appealed to the left or the poor, Duterte appealed to the right. They both denounced the elites of civil society, dubbing them evil society, as in the case of ERAP, or Dilawans, or yellow forces, as in the case of Duterte. So whenever you have a group of people who feel excluded in society, whether they be the poor masses, left behind by globalization, or the victims of violent crime, drug syndicates, and the like, you have fertile ground on which populist leaders like these can weave their magic. All right, so that's a summary of the global forces. So around the world, you know, events have conspired to really bring this about in the Philippines. But apart from the global forces, there are now the local forces, which I'd like to mention. So let's now look at the reasons particular or specific to the Philippines that led to democratic forces falling out of favor. Number three is the ineptitude or failure of the political elites to govern effectively. Okay, so elite failure, if you, for want of a better term. In 2016, there were 3 to 4 populists running against one moderate for the presidency of the country, in the person of Jojo Binay and Grace Poe, who were populists claiming the mantle of Joseph Estrada and Fernando Poe Jr. On the left. On the right, you had Duterte and Senator Miriam Santiago, who were populists on the right, as I said. So, 3 to 4 Senator Santiago was already ailing at that point. It was clear that her mental faculties were going due to her brain tumor at that point. So, depending on how you count this, there were 3 to 4 populists, main contenders for the presidency. And then you had a moderate in the person of Mar Rojas, who was the sole centrist candidate. And you would have thought that in that field, right, the left and the right would cancel each other out because they were vying basically for the same set of votes, and the moderate would win. But that's not what happened. There was a swing late in the election cycle from supporters of Binay and Poe, who swung to Duterte in the end. So why did this happen? Some say Poe, who gradually moved to the center, ate away at the votes of Rojas, but actually she could claim it was the other way around. Preferential polls revealed at the time that those who voted for Senator Poe, or who were planning to vote for her, had Duterte as their second choice. So, if anything, she was eating away at Duterte's votes, not at Rojas's. The question is, why was the administration candidate so unpopular? Given that his predecessor, President Noynoy Aquino, had actually retained his high popularity ratings all the way to the end of his term. And so why was his chosen successor not voted in? Nor was he elected for in May last year to become to have a seat in the Senate. The answer is perhaps many people felt that though they were well-meaning and though they were honest, the political class whom they represented, whom Rojas and co-represent, failed to provide good and effective governance during their time in office under President Noynoy Aquino. Failed to provide good and effective governance. What do we mean by effective governance? Well, it means doing the right things, which means having or instilling a professional bureaucracy with merit-based appointments, not out of political favor, prudent fiscal and economic governance, appropriate and sufficient delivery of basic services, proper defense of the realm, which means not surrendering our sovereignty or control over our borders, and rational infrastructure spending and urban planning. It also means observing the rule of law or doing things right. which means maintaining the independence of the courts, free from political influence or interference, efficiently dispensing justice, protecting the rights of individuals and the sanctity of contracts, enforcing equality before the law, by providing access to legal services and a fair trial for everyone, and finally, observing the even application of the law, not favoring anyone. Daang matuwid, or the right path that the previous administration used as its mantra, was meant to usher us into a period of enlightened governance in the country. And to their credit, they tried to do this by expanding social programs in a fiscally responsible manner, with the 4Ps, or Pantawid Pamilya program, a conditional cash grant scheme, as well as expanding healthcare to indigent families. It failed, however, to provide adequate physical infrastructure to keep up with the times. Its PPP, or Public Private Partnership flagship program, which was itself a vestige of the neoliberal economic policies adopted by Mrs. Corazon Aquino's government in the 1980s, failed to deliver projects on time, failed to deliver the much needed improvements in transport, logistics, and other infrastructure. Their Development Acceleration Program, or DAP, was ruled unconstitutional by the highest court of the land and was thwarted or abused by congressmen and senators, with fake projects costing the taxpayer billions of pesos that could have been used to build much needed infrastructure. So, all of this points to a failure, really, to provide effective and good governance. The fourth reason was the lack of executive competence on the part of the president. So, lack of effective executive competence is the fourth reason, specific to the Philippines. The president had spent his whole political career in the legislative branch, deliberating on laws. And his lack of executive competence really showed and was evidenced by the failure of governance at many levels. His father, Ninoy, had at least been a town mayor and provincial governor of Tarlac before becoming a senator. But Noynoy's only experience at managing things was as a sales manager for Mondragon Enterprises, the outfit of his late mother's former tourism secretary. Noynoy's mishandling of the fallout of the Luneta hostage-taking crisis and the Mamasapano police operation, which ended in the massacre of the Hong Kong nationals and the entire Special Forces group of policemen in Mamasapano, was an indictment on his leadership and executive capability. Mar Rojas, who at least served in the executive branch under former President Erap Estrada and Gloria Arroyo, should have at least done better. But the problems at the transport department with the MRT, which was operated by a group that he had a long-standing disagreement with, and the mishandling of the post-Yolanda recovery efforts, truly exposed his lack of decisiveness and executive ability overall. So that was the fourth reason: the lack of executive competence on both the president and his chosen successor's part, for which the people had just barely had enough. And then the fifth reason is their inability to dispense justice fairly or evenly. Inability to dispense justice fairly or evenly. This was also exposed following the impeachment of Chief Justice Corona and the Janet Napoles scandal. Only non-allies of the president and his party were prosecuted and jailed after the scandal broke out, even though some of their allies were implicated by the whistleblowers. So ineffective governance and failure to observe the rule of law is what led to the collapse of support for the Daang Matuwid coalition in 2016. This led to a political backlash from all social and income groups. It didn't matter whether you were wealthy, educated, or not. Polls revealed that voters had turned away from the so-called yellow forces. So that's now history. We come now to the question of how do they win back this support, right? I hope like we can all agree those are all the reasons that I've cited are probably true. We can litigate them till the cows come home, but in the end, the question is, how do we win back support? All right, for democracy, because it's truly at risk. We face a crisis in our democracy. People want Duterte to become a dictator. They want him to declare revolutionary government and the like, impose martial law, or do something really drastic of that sort, right? Because people have had enough. So how do you win that argument? How do you win back the trust of people? All right, in quick succession, in no particular order. Number one, so obviously, if they failed, they lost favor because of poor execution on their part. They need to sharpen their executive capabilities, improve their executive capabilities. It's the first solution. How do they do that? Well, they need to find candidates with proven executive competence, right? We love our mayors. And mayors around the world are generally liked. Jokowi and Bukele were first mayors of Jakarta and San Salvador before becoming president. Our very own Erap Estrada, Jojo Binay, and Rudy Duterte were all former mayors. In the era of local autonomy, metropolitan city mayors, not provincial governors, rule. Isko, the mayor of Manila now, is being touted as a future presidential candidate. We like decisive leaders, those who get things done, as opposed to scholarly senators and congressmen who deliberate and craft bills meticulously. We want men of action, men and women of action, as opposed to men and women of books. Jesse Robredo was one such type on the yellow bench, which is increasingly looking shallow at the moment. His widow, Vice President Leni Robredo, has tried to offer her own version of good governance, known as Chinelas economics. Her program of channeling charitable donations to marginalized communities was, however, cited by the Commission on Audit for its failure to liquidate expenses. This is something that her camp needs to address. And just as an aside, wouldn't it be good to have regional autonomy? I know we're discussing that now under the push for federalism, but just wouldn't it be good to just have regional autonomy as a halfway house so that our mayors and governors who prove themselves and perform well in their cities and provinces could then have another larger area over which they could govern, so as to prepare them to eventually seek higher office and run the country later on. As Duterte has said in the past, he was totally unprepared, having moved from the office of a mayor to the president. He was totally unprepared for the gravity or scale of the problems he would be confronted with as president. There is just such a big chasm that now exists between governing at the local level and at the national level. Somehow, if we're going to elect people with executive capability, we need a better way of grooming them, these future leaders of the country, by gradually expanding their knowledge and skill sets, by expanding their scope until they're ripe for national office. Wouldn't you agree? So, improving their executive capabilities, finding candidates with the proven competence. The second way is to work to expand opportunities for the middle class as an antidote to populism, as opposed to pandering to a very narrow set of social groups. which is what the opposition did at the last election. Vice President Lenny's gambit failed. Obviously, Ochos Derechos platform, which her Ahon Laylayan coalition wrote, made it difficult for them to appeal to the broad middle class. And while I salute the vice president for engaging in, what I would consider as principle-based politics, the problem wasn't that. The problem was the content of their policies was just too narrow. Unlike PDP Laban's platform, which offered better services, better service and better service delivery to the broad middle class, including overseas Filipino workers, households who are using water and improving traffic and the like. I'm not diminishing the importance of securing the rights of LGBTQI or the indigenous, urban poor, or drug dependents. What I am saying is that these are not uppermost in the minds of the struggling households in the suburbs of Cavite and Laguna, for instance, struggling to make a living while traveling 3 to 4 hours a day to the city and back for work, putting kids through school and then university, and having to deal with ailing parents, seniors who need care. What these people want, what's uppermost in their mind, is to have efficient transport, safe streets for their kids, access to education and healthcare, stable prices, and better wages. So expanding opportunities for the middle class would mean working at this point with the administration to fast-track infrastructure and jobs programs, passing fiscal, financial, and regulatory reforms to spur investment and entrepreneurship, and help pay for social programs like the Universal Healthcare Law, as well as improving urban planning systems, increasing the rate of home ownership, and improving the regulation of water, power, and telecommunications in a way that promotes the interests of consumers, as well as the stability and sustainability of the system. So, if you do this, you'll generate a middle class, and what happens is this middle class, the people who belong to the middle class, will feel a stake in the system. And if they feel a stake in the system, they won't vote for someone to wreck the system, right? They'll want to preserve it. So, this is important. Increasing the ranks of the middle class, increasing opportunities for people to reach the middle class is the second approach. The third one is to improve the functioning of political parties to move us away from personality, celebrity-driven politics. What we have now are three major parties, all right? Acquired by three different corporate entities owned by billionaire tycoons. You have NUP, the Unity Party, the National Unity Party from the remnants of Ramos's Lakas NUCD party, run by the ports magnate Enrique Razon, a close friend of Mrs. Arroyo's husband. That's NUP. NPC, under the patronage of Danding Cojuangco formerly, and now under Ramon Ang's sponsorship. Ang, who is the Cojuangco's successor at San Miguel. And the Nacionalista Party, run by the family of Manny Villar, the former Senate president, who is the richest man in the country at this point. Together, these three parties, NUP, NPC, and NP, control 42% of districts in the country, a total of 103 seats. That's a sizable chunk, about a third of the Congress. The remaining institutional parties are Lakas, the Liberal Party, and PDP Laban, which together control 47% of districts, or 115 seats. The rest are mom and pop operations, remnants of their founders, such as PMP of the Estrada clan, PRP of the late Miriam Santiago, HNP of the Dutertes, and the LDP of the Angaras, which account for the remaining 10% or 25 seats. Even party list groups are now run by rich individuals. So in politics as in business, when you have large conglomerates competing with small and medium sized enterprises run like mom and pop operations, how can you ensure that competition is free and fair? We're talking here about our elections and our representatives. So, first of all, what we need to do is ask the question whether it is right. Is it right that the captains of industry run about a third of Congress through their political parties? Right? So, basics. Should those who decide on the regulations, the awarding of contracts, the setting of budgets, the renewal of franchises, should the people who decide on that be subordinate to the business tycoons, the corporate interests of the country? Obviously, the answer is no, right? But secondly, if these patrons weren't there, how would these parties survive? How can we ensure that parties are based on ideas, principles, and programs of government rather than on personalities or worse, corporate interests? So the answer is that in most democracies around the world, it doesn't matter whether in the northern or southern hemisphere, democracies around the world have adopted some form of state sponsorship of political parties. This means that parties receive financial support from the taxpayer if they meet certain criteria. Criteria such as the disclosure of their sources of finance, which shouldn't include large donations from individuals or corporations. And these disclosures must be properly audited by something like the Commission on Audit, for instance. Political party reform, in other words, which, unlike federalism or charter change, have sponsors from across the aisle and across the political spectrum, which have also passed in the lower house, but not in the Senate. Political party reform is needed. So now the question is why not create a unity ticket to push for these reforms that would institutionalize political parties and make them independent from corporate interests? What's stopping us from doing that? Number four, the fourth way to regain legitimacy is to improve the functioning of our courts and judicial system as a whole. Declogging the courts so that justice is dispensed with efficiently. Now, this could mean reviewing the structure of the courts, creating specialist courts, family courts, corruption-related courts, etc. It could mean increasing the number of judges around the country. It could also mean applying modern IT systems in judicial administration, strengthening the prosecutorial arm of the government as well as ensuring access to legal counsel. Aside from these, reforming our sentencing laws and policies, as well as improving our jail and rehabilitation system. And finally, ensuring the independence of the Department of Justice, Office of the Solicitor General, at all times, which should never be used for political purposes ever again. So let's end the political vendetta that has been going on to and fro over the last decade or so. Fifth, they could improve our mechanisms for democratic accountability. How? Well, by improving our election system, right? Which has been cast in doubt. Improving the conduct of our elections, improving the way we hold public officials to account, strengthening the Commission on Audit and the Office of the Ombudsman to investigate and indict corrupt officials, improve the efficiency of the Sandigan Bayan to hear such cases, and strengthening the prosecutorial arm of the government as well. Finally, making the appointment of judges and justices more transparent. So these are ways we can improve the mechanisms for democratic accountability. by having these checks and balances in place. Lastly, number 6, strengthen citizen involvement and participation in public life. Right, so this could mean having town hall meetings, informal meetups, listening tours, and the like. Social media is just too toxic for this at the moment. So it's necessary to improve the level of discourse and stop the name calling. Please, stop the name calling, scapegoating, and tribalism, and start to build bridges. Engage in coalition building rather than virtue signaling and internal purges of the ranks. The pro democratic forces need to expand their base and be more inclusive in the way they reach out to the general public. So that's it. That's my summary of why democratic or yellow forces have fallen out of favor and how they can win it back. Did I miss anything? Please tell me through the comments in the section below. I hope to hear from you soon. This has been another edition of the Cusp. I'm Doy Santos. Thanks for watching.